Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for joining us, everybody. We're excited to be here. So maybe just we'll jump kind of right in. We're going to talk about J-1 English proficiency, and our goal today is really to kind of highlight how some of the institutions are processing those changes with how they might view the English proficiency or how the procedures for that, but also to share some really solid longitudinal, really great data that's been collected by excuse me, by English 3 and home base for years and years now, kind of about how the field is also viewing English proficiency needs and concerns and procedures that way. So just by way of introduction, my name is Sam Brown, pardon me, and I'm the director for the International Student and Scholar Services at Brigham Young University in Utah. And Moroni, we'll turn time over to you to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, I'm Moroni Flake. I'm with English 3 and I'm also with Home Base. I've been working with English proficiency since maybe 2012, and so been in international education for a long while. So was around when the new Subpart A requirements for English proficiency came out. Since then, we've had, like Sam said, we've done many surveys, had probably hundreds of conversations with different institutions to get different perspectives. And there are a lot of different perspectives, and had many conversations with the Department of State, various reps from the Department of State. And so been able to get broad exposure and see trends over time. And we'll talk about some of those today, but excited to talk about it with Sam.
Awesome. So Moroni mentioned J-1 Subpart A, so we're going to jump right into there. We thought kind of a good way to start is the regulatory base and foundation for why English proficiency even is required, right? So you all remember, if you were here in the field at that time when J-1 Subpart A came out and kind of highlighted English proficiency as one of the things, along with all of the insurance options and things we had to go with. And one of the unique aspects of the J-1 Subpart A is it actually, in my opinion, gave a lot more specifics about English proficiency than a lot of the other Code of Federal Regulations, areas do. They tend to be a little bit more broad and vague. But in this one, they actually said that the visitor coming to our campuses has to, quote, possess sufficient proficiency in the English language as determined by an objective measurement. We're going to come back to that here in a little bit, of English language, and then that they have to be able to participate in their program and function on a day-to-day basis. And so this is where you kind of get into that, the Fulbright-Hays Act of 1961 that really talks about those cultural exchanges and the value of people coming here and the United States sending people out as little A ambassadors and having those cultural exchanges is more than just being part of the lab that they might be working in on a campus. It's the day-to-day function, right? It's the community that they're a part of, not just in the work or the research that they might be doing. And then here's where, like I mentioned, it kind of gets into even some specifics about what that English proficiency examination needs to be. So it says here at the bottom that English language proficiency has to come through a recognized English language test by signed documentation from an academic institution or an English language school, or, and this is the part we're going to delve into with my campus later here, through a documented interview conducted by the sponsor, and then it even detailed how that sponsor could do it. And so, like I said, this was more detailed, in my opinion, than most of the Code of Federal Regulation tends to be in areas such as this. And then if you fast forward, so after this came out, oh, yeah, thanks, Rona. So if you fast forward
Hey, one comment on that before we jump to the next slide. So I had a conversation last year with one of the reps from the Department of State, and we got into a little bit of a back and forth about how things are understood. And she said this underlying part here. So she said that when through a documented interview conducted by the sponsor, she said the sponsor refers to the RO or the ARO, not to the sponsoring department. And she said she said that the ARO or the RO must be present at the interview. And I said, hold on, pause 1 second. Can you say that one more time? Hold on, pause. Can you say that one more time? Like, just for clarity. And then I just said, that's not how that's actively being interpreted. And that would not be workable at many institutions, at most institutions. And so we had a back and forth on this and what that meant. But she said ultimately the responsibility comes back to the responsible officer. The responsible officer is the individual ultimately accountable for alignment with the regulations. And so that was just a brief highlight on the conversation there. We'll get a little bit more into the weeds on that one in a little bit.
Thanks, Moroni. So then fast forward, still a while ago for us, but a while in the future from when J-1 Subpart I came out. In August of 2019, the Department of State issued a guidance directive. And they said, I'm going to read this in full, which is horrible practice on a Zoom call, but I think this is important. They said the department has observed from outreach and site reviews, exchange visitors with noticeably poor English speaking skills, pardon me, which may indicate a sponsor has not screened prospective candidates for English language proficiency consistent with the CFRs. Inadequate English skills may lead to program deficiencies and compromise the health, safety, and welfare of exchange visitors. And then it gets into how long we should maintain those tests as well. So this is something that the Department of State has addressed and has actually gone out and kind of analyzed a little bit. And we'll talk about in a minute how that happened on my campus as well. So with that in mind, let's turn some time over to Moroni for the data and the surveys.
Sorry, navigating to mute. Okay, so yeah, we've conducted 5 surveys over the last decade, starting just after the new requirements came out in 2015. First survey was in 2016. We've had 511 responses from 235 institutions. Most of those responses have been those directly working with scholars, directors, assistant or associate directors, or advisors. Occasionally, we'll get some responses from SIOs or others. And these responses cover all institutions: state schools, private schools, public schools, public and private, and then small and large institutions. And so we can break down when those become different based upon the institution, but it really covers the gamut. So first question, we want to make sure, hey, are we all on the same page as to like the baseline importance of J-1 proficiency? So which statement best represents your view of English proficiency? So 95% said that English proficiency is always, or at least occasionally, crucial to the success of the exchange visit. Said, what risks of J-1s, what are the risks of J-1s arriving with insufficient English proficiency? And the number one response there was the inability to understand their rights or responsibilities as a visitor to the United States. That's particularly relevant now. We did a survey this last week with different institutions and about what content they want us to help them create for their scholar populations. And the number 2 response was knowing their legal rights in the USA. And then the next was isolation or inability to integrate into the community. If we look back at the purpose of the J-1 exchange program, it is cultural exchange. And so this is really key for them. And every institution, that you have to make those reports to the Department of State. And I will say that in my conversations with scholars and in my anecdotally and also through surveys, that isolation is a challenge for many scholars. Working in a lab, and then they don't have the proficiency, or they just don't have ways of connecting with others. So communities is a really big piece here. Health and safety. In my time, I should say many of the institutions that I've talked to have run into incidences with J-1s not having the proficiency they need to get effective healthcare in time, or to communicate with a police officer when they get pulled over, or to fill in any number of blanks here. It especially compounds if they bring a dependent. In our surveys that we do, about 35% of scholars bring a dependent, either a partner or a child. And if they don't have proficiency, then that compounds the issues. But if the J-1, if the principal J-1 has the proficiency, it typically works out fine. Okay, so health and safety, poor cultural experience was the next one, and then the inability to participate in their program. I will say that for State Department audit or visit, or sending visitors home, when we first started those surveys, these are the latest ones from 2024. When we started those were much lower numbers. So it was maybe 10% that first year were considering or had sent a scholar home or that saw that as a risk. That's significantly increased. Same thing with Department of State audits or visits. Has your institution shortened an exchange visit due to insufficient English proficiency? I'll just read this anecdote. Oh, it looks like we're missing the labels there. But so the 8% there at the bottom is that they didn't want to respond. The 38% said yes. And so about 40% of institutions have shortened an exchange visit due to insufficient English proficiency. Here's one quote from one medical institution. She said, we had a number of scholars arrive with low English proficiency within a short time period, one of which did result in the scholar having to return home. That's why we feel so strongly that independent assessment of English proficiency is so important. All right, when an English interview is needed, who completes the interview? When we did our first survey, when the results or when the requirements came out in 2015, what we saw was 93% of institutions were allowing the department to make the judgment call. Most of that was just through signing a PDF saying that they'd conducted an interview, and that was typically what was done there. And then in looking at each of the surveys we've done since in the intervening years, we've seen that number continually decrease. And so now of the latest survey respondents, 52% of institutions allow for a sponsoring department or PI. I would say that the larger institutions, I should say that maybe the top 10 largest, most of those allow for a sponsoring department or PI. If you know the dynamics of working in those institutions, it's often quite decentralized. The larger component or the larger group of individuals or universities that have shifted are mid-sized state schools with mid-sized J-1 scholar populations. But I will say across the board, we've seen movements. So we've seen it all across the board. In some universities, we'll get into some of the details here, but some institutions will, instead of removing the department interview, they'll do adjustments. For example, they will take an education first. They'll do first approach with their departments. They'll do lunch and learns. They'll talk about the need. They'll work to get leadership buy-in for at least understanding the challenges that may be happening on their campus. And then they'll start to make incremental changes. So one of the Ivies, for example, just removed last year. They said that the department can do the interview, but the sponsoring or any direct supervisor cannot be involved. So the PI cannot be involved. So it could be staff from the department, and then they added other testing options, and that has moved a lot of their scholars just because staff don't want to necessarily take on that responsibility. That's moved a lot of the interviews away from the department just naturally by doing that education first approach. So there are some that still allow for interviews, but have made tweaks to the ways that they to the ways that they allow or the details of how they allow it. So when an English interview is needed, who completes the interview? 52% said that the sponsoring department or PI. 23% said a third-party English assessment. 8% said the English language department. If that is an option on your campus, that oftentimes is working well, but the logistics of pulling that off can sometimes be difficult. But if you have it running, what we find is they're generally satisfied with it. 8% said that they just don't allow an interview, or 8% also said that the international office or a designated individual conducts that interview. One of the early on universities that we talked with was Texas A&M, and back in 2016, they were inviting about 1,200 scholars a year, and they had one individual in the office who was conducting all interviews. And so that you can imagine how that was a challenge for them. Most of the ones now that have the international office or designated individual conducting it are very small offices. Okay, so I know there's a lot of numbers on the screen. I'll try to break it down. So the drawbacks are what drawbacks are associated with the current method of completing interviews. So if we look at, we go back. If we look at the department interview, the primary drawbacks are individuals conducting the interviews may have a conflict of interest. Makes perfect sense. Individuals are not qualified to evaluate English proficiency. It's not best practice or the time required to complete the interviews. Only 38% of institutions who are allowing the department interviews said that that process is working well for them. The international office, the primary drawbacks are the time required and the scheduling constraints. Oftentimes the larger populations are coming from Asia, and that can be a challenge scheduling those interviews. And then English or IEPD department, it's the same thing, scheduling constraints and the time required to conduct the interview. And then those who have been able to make the transition to a third party are generally satisfied with that. What is your perspective of the current English proficiency policy? The percent responding satisfied. So 92% said they're satisfied with a third party, 68% said the English language department, 50% said the international office, 50% are satisfied. 50% of those who do not allow an interview are satisfied with that, and then 47% said they're satisfied. This next one's really interesting to me because it's kind of a mental exercise of where in the international office would you also get a similar result? Because this is the percent that responded satisfied with the current policy based upon what their role is within the office. So 38% of scholar advisors are satisfied with the current English proficiency policies. And then 68% of directors are satisfied. Why would twice as many directors say that, on a percent basis, say that they're satisfied? Oftentimes, I would projecting and guessing is that scholar advisors are the ones that are interacting with scholars. They're the ones responding to emails, or they're the ones doing the orientation or the intake, and they're seeing blank stares as they're talking to these scholars. They're seeing the challenges, and they're having to deal with the challenges. So scholar advisors are the ones more on the ground. Also, I think directors may be a little bit more practical of thinking, hey, I don't want to deal with pushback. And so they're more inclined to be satisfied with the current policy. So there's a couple comments there. Then what elements of your J-1 English process would you like to improve? The number one response was consistency. So scholars arriving on campus consistently being able to speak proficiently makes perfect sense. Number two response was improving the J-1 applicant experience. A comment on that is we have done many surveys, thousands of surveys to scholars about what's important to them in the process. Number one and number two, right with each other, is can they do it quickly? Can they get done with the process very quickly? And for example, they don't want to take a TOEFL, go to a testing center, have to register a month in advance, travel, and then wait 2 weeks for their results. And then also, they don't want to take a student test. They don't want to take a 2 to 4 hour student test. So that's obviously inconvenient for them. So can they get it done very quickly on their time frame? And then the second one is convenience. Can they do it? Can they do it from their home? Can they do it quickly? Can they do it online? And so those were the primary focuses there. Actually, the next slide talks a little bit about that. So most important factors for scholars. So convenience and speed, and then 18% of 18% identified cost as a concern. Okay, so going back, I'm all over the place here. Sorry. Reduced liability was the next response of elements they'd like to improve. Next one was streamline within their ISSS software. So how do they make this just an automated checklist item, easily completed through Synapsys or through Teradata? And then others were removing the burden from department and removing the processing burden from the international office. So going back to scholar concerns, so 19% of J1s reported that self-reported, this is through a survey, that they are not confident in their ability to communicate during an emergency. 31% of J1s reported that they're not confident in their dependents' ability to communicate in emergency. I know that J2s, their proficiency is not going to be covered in the regulations, and we really haven't covered much in the surveys here. But I will say that if the J1 has proficiency, that can mitigate, obviously many of the challenges there. All right, back to Sam.
Okay, so we're going to kind of transition from what is the field looking at as far as those survey responses. to a little bit of just a story about my campus and why we made a change and how that came to be. So, pardon me. In 2017, we actually received one of those meet and greet site visits that the Department of State did, I think all over the country here. And as part of that, even though it wasn't necessarily meant to be an audit or them checking up on campuses from what we were told, there still were quite a few questions that were asked that kind of felt that way. And in the process, our RO at the time, being very honest, said, we actually have seen some challenges with English proficiency. There's been a few times where a scholar shows up for an orientation, and through the orientation, we can tell it's really a struggle to communicate, and we're not sure how they passed. Well, at that time, we were doing the PI interviews almost exclusively. There were some who had taken a TOEFL or some test before because they had gone to school, and so that was different. But for those who didn't have something already in place, it was by huge amounts, vastly being done by the department and that PI. And so we chatted with them about that, and the Department of State at the time very directly told us that's a subjective interview, not an objective one. And so going back to the Code of Federal Regulations, it very clearly says that English proficiency must be assessed through an objective measurement, not through a subjective one. And if we're being fair, at the time, we could see that, right? You have kind of back to some of those questions that Moroni highlighted. If you are the faculty member who is bringing a scholar to research with you, you have a vested interest in that scholar coming, and you might be a little bit more open to saying, yeah, they'll be fine with our English, even if that's not true. So, and then kind of back to some of the things Moroni has said as well, they told us in this meet and greet that if the scholar does come and we see a problem with English proficiency, it's the responsibility of the responsible officer to send that scholar home within 30 days. And so that was news to us. And I've been an RO, and I don't know, for those of you out there, that frightens me a great deal. Having to have somebody who's already spent all of the money from either their department or home, government or whatever it is that's funding this, to come out here to be told, you now have to turn around and go back home. I don't want to deal with that. And I certainly don't want to deal with my faculty who would not be happy with that at all. So that started for us kind of this process to say, okay, we know we need to change because they told us directly, stop doing what you're doing and make it more objective. And so from there, we kind of went on a journey to figure it out and to decide what we were going to do. And I'll talk a little bit more. I think after this, Marne, is that we're going to go into a story from another campus as well. And so put a pin in that one. We're going to talk about an experience from another campus, and then we'll talk about my campus's process.
Yeah, so really briefly highlighting, so Luis Johnson, who's the director at University of Florida, often does this presentation with us. I'll just really briefly highlight some of what they went through, starting, I believe, in 2020, and then they essentially went through a 3-year audit process with the Department of State that was kicked off when a scholar was in an accident. And you'll see here, oopsies, what happened? Okay, so the Department of State conclusion was essential treatment and support were greatly hampered as a result of his or her inability to effectively speak English. And so that kicked off a process and a review of their internal policies. And what happened over time was they essentially reiterated the same thing that they said to Sam, that if a scholar arrives without proficiency, that is the responsibility of the RO to send them home no later than 30 days from the program begin date. And then they sent a few scholars home that then highlighted a concern again to the Department of State, saying, "Hey, why are you still having challenges? What do we need to look through?" And they highlighted that a documented interview, signing a PDF was insufficient, and that the interview, so it says here, through a video or voice recording or thorough notes, and that those should be maintained for 3 years. And so going through all of those challenges, having the departments experience those challenges, eventually University of Florida at the beginning of 2022 was the RO had been pushing for this, and they were able to fully remove the department interview and fully remove the challenges related to that. And then, since then, they haven't had any scholars in the last, since 2022, January of 2022, be sent home. They haven't had challenges with consistent proficiency. They've been able to adjust that, but this was all kicked off by a major incident, a major health incident with one of their scholars. We used to, at the beginning of this, say, which would you least like to have? Send a scholar home, have to deal with a major medical institute related with a scholar, or go through a Department of State audit. And then Luis was the kind soul who had to go through all of those. So we do a little bit of sharing here. And if you would ever like to talk with Luis, I'm sure I can connect you with him, and he can talk through their experience.
Okay, thank you. And I'll add one thing to that too. We had mentioned to the Department of State visitors that in one occasion where we had a scholar who absolutely didn't have the English proficiency, pardon me, and we had talked to the department about it, and the department on campus, I mean the PI, and they had said, well, what if we send them to our English language center for a semester to kind of build that up before they jump into the research? So we did that. We moved them to the English language center and then back to their program. And the Department of State said that was absolutely inappropriate. That wasn't the purpose that they were there for. They didn't come to learn English. They came for the research, the cultural exchanges, the experiences, not the language proficiency. And we were told you should have sent that scholar home. That should have been a time when you just said, come back after you've been able to get the language proficiency. So long story short, we knew at that point, because we were told directly, you need to change how you're doing things. And so we went through kind of a journey to explore what are the options that we have. So we talked to our English language center, excuse me, to our English department, and they were very honest and direct in saying, we don't have the bandwidth for that. We're not going to do this. So we went to our English language center after that, and same thing. They said, that's not our purpose and focus. So we're not going to do that either. We talked to different department administrators and got some pushback on that too, because again, depending on your population, we don't have a huge population, but it's still enough that it's a burden and would cause extra load on the plate, right? We've always accepted standardized testing, that, the TOEFL and things like that. But to Moroni's point, especially back in the day, those were a little bit more complicated to find and access, and the time commitment and monetary commitment was big. So we explored internally as well. Is it something that our office could do? And apart from just the bandwidth, knowing that was going to add a lot to our load, we didn't feel like we had the expertise, right? It's Calvin brought this up in the chat. You're talking to a PI, you're probably talking some of the technical language of your field. And not only do we not have the expertise to talk about the technical things they might be doing on campus, we don't have the ability to assess really in an objective way how their English language might impact them in all of the aspects and facets of the community they'll be a part of. So we felt like that was too hard for us to do. And then ultimately we started looking at a bunch of other things. English 3 was an option that we chose because of some of the convenience and approaches and costs that they do. We still accept the TOEFL and IELTS if they've taken a degree that's a 4-year degree here in the United States at an English language, an English speaking school institution. Chances are they're going to have gone through testing for that anyway, but we would accept that degree as proof as well. And so there's a big gathering and bigger pile of things that we can offer now than we did back then when it was largely the PI. But what we find is most of our scholars tend to go through English 3 and some of that route for some of the reasons I mentioned. So one of the things I always, whenever you see a presentation and somebody's talking just about all the great things and how everything is perfect and magical and wonderful, I always think there's so much more to that story, and walk away wanting to know more about what were the hard things, right? What were the challenges you went through as you did this? So I wanted to talk about that a little bit too. And these are real. I'm not going to downplay or sugarcoat this. When we went away from the PI, we had major pushback from our faculty. We had upset deans. We had very upset faculty. We had people who were telling us that we were accusing them of not being professional in what they were doing or being negligent. Like there was pushback, and I'm not gonna say there wasn't. There was pushback on the cost as well, because the PI interview was free. That was easy for them to do and convenient and free. and having something that's moving, pivoting to a test was going to cost money. And so those were the two biggest challenges that we saw as that transition kind of went through. One of the nice things with that, and I realize that this doesn't happen all the time and on every campus, we had some really good support from our leadership, so that when those deans and higher level individuals might be pushing back, my leadership was really great to support us and say, this is what what we're doing, and it needs to be done. It was also easy for us to say, we had a visit from the Department of State and they told us we needed to change this. And so that didn't stop the pushback, but it certainly mitigated it when we could say, this isn't actually coming from us. We didn't just make this decision lightly. We were told directly that we needed to do it. The nice thing is that transition, that it was probably a solid year and a half that we got pushback, and it died down over that year and a half. And now it's at a point where it's just a normal part of our process. So as hard as that transition was, now I get very little to no pushback whatsoever from the faculty and administration on our campus. We feel like we really have aligned it better with those regulations. We feel like, excuse me, sorry, I'm coming off of something and still coughing. We feel like it really does a better job of creating a better experience for our scholars and their families too, as Moroni mentioned, who, had English proficiency been a challenge, would have experienced some hardships and some difficult things as well. And it has decreased the workload for us in ISSS, right? So if nothing else, the burden of feeling like, okay, we're going to have to send a scholar home and we're going to have to be the bad guy, excuse me, the one making those decisions that might alienate parts of our campus and make them upset. One of our big concerns, and I was concerned about this from the beginning, is that adding this might decrease the number of scholars that, pardon me, that we were seeing on our campus. And the nice thing is we haven't seen that. While it does add a little bit, it hasn't stopped them from coming. Ronnie, did you have a comment too?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that across all campuses. So every institution that we are working with has made the same message that this has not affected numbers, and so just some statistics on that. So about 70% of those who use English 3, I think it's like 63% or something, get the score they need on the first try. And of those who then do a retake within a month, are 93% of those who do not pass the first time are able to pass the second time. So that only leaves a fraction of individuals who don't pass in the first month. And in our experience, 100% of those individuals who do tutoring are able to pass within 3 months. And so for the broad majority, the vast majority of the population, they're able to get the scores they need within immediately or within weeks. And for those who do not, they're able to get it eventually. And so it can delay a program. It's not meant to be a filter. In no situations is it meant to be a filter. If an individual doesn't come, what we see is that the PI fills that spot with another individual. So we just across the board have not seen this become an issue. What it's doing is it's highlighting the challenge before more serious challenges arise from it. And so it's saying, okay, what preventative measures can we put in place? So some institutions will require, okay, here's a minimum score, but if you can make a compelling reason as to why they are okay to be slightly lower on their score, then there's some flexibility. Some institutions will allow some discretion. So, for example, when they do our the English 3 interview, there's a video interview that the R or AR can go view. And so there can be there's sometimes some discretion on, okay, I think this is okay if it's just right, close to the bar. But yeah, I would just say across the board, this has not been it has not reduced numbers. I would also say that it helps to have supporting statements from the Department of State. And so in the conversations that I've had, they've reiterated over and over again, every individual I've talked to has reiterated that if an RO or ARO is wanting support, then they should reach out, and they can provide a letter. They can hop on a conversation, And so there can be some sort of backing or support from the Department of State. Sometimes just these anecdotes from other institutions is sufficient. Sometimes they already know, leadership already knows it's an issue and just and hasn't addressed it yet. So we see a wide variety, but what we often would say is that let me actually go to the next slide here. Is if we don't say we're not recommending what you should do at your institution, but if you do look at adjusting policies, then there's a broad spread of choices that can be taken in the process. So you could remove the PI full altogether. If you have leadership buy-in, then you can go through that process. Some institutions kind of wade into the water a little bit more. Like I said with the Cornell example earlier, where they just removed they said the direct supervisors cannot be involved, or they do lunch and learns where they have open conversations. So there's a number of ways to start the process of making adjustments to the policies at your institution. And Sam.
Yeah. So what we will say, so like Ronnie said, we won't tell you what you should do, but we will give recommendations, whatever your practice is. These are good recommendations for all of the regulatory field that we live in, right? But whatever you do, make sure that you're able to defend it as an objective measure of that English proficiency and be able to say, this is why we do what we do and why we believe that this is okay. And always, again, with especially this field, be consistent with it. Whatever you choose, don't make those exceptions because you really like that faculty member and they're pushing really hard, or you don't want pushback, and so you'll say, okay, I'll just let this one go. I think consistency is a big name in the game here for us in this field. Anything we can do to improve compliance. I love the surveys that Moroni shared, and pardon me, I'll be honest with you, fear of a Department of State audit or sanctions of some kind are a big concern for me, right? That would be a massive challenge for our office. And so anything we can do to improve that compliance and feel safe is not only good for our office, but ultimately infinitely better for the scholars who come to our campuses and our institutions. I do think it's fair to say, though, what can we do that won't add extra burden to the international offices or the sponsoring departments? And so as you look for whatever your processes are, I think that's a fair assessment to make. And it's something that we have to deal with. And then going back to, again, the purpose of the Fulbright-Hays Act and the J-1 program and those cultural exchanges, I really, truly do believe that those who come and visit our campuses have much better experiences if the English proficiency is at a level that they're able to adequately communicate, not just in the work and research that they do, but in the day-to-day life that they're going to live and lead here in our communities. And then another just kind of last thing to consider as you're looking at things, that implementation, what that looks like, should be as convenient for the ISSS office as possible. Where possible, if you can streamline it with software, that's a positive thing as well and helps. And so look for those solutions that maybe, again, don't increase the burden, might even reduce the burden for those of us that are the boots on the ground interfacing with those scholars at the orientations and throughout their processes here. So again, not telling you what you should do, but we think these are some good recommendations as you assess your English language proficiency assessments and practices and look at what you might do in the future.
Yeah, if you have any questions related to general English proficiency policies or anything, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll walk through some of those. And but I'll just give a real quick highlight or real quick summary of what we are working on as a solution, or what we provide as a solution for scholars. So like we mentioned, the most important thing to them is convenience. And so so the way that we work with this is they link over either directly from a Synapsys e-form if you're using Synapsys, or just a link on your website. They link over, they register, they can immediately go and complete the interview same day, asynchronously whenever they want, and then they can get a score back within 24 hours. So for them, it's a very, very quick turnaround, and it's very convenient. It takes them about 25 minutes to complete the interview, and our approach has essentially been instead of let's take an assessment the same way that it was done in the 1970s with a paper multiple choice and just move it online. It's like, no, like we can move forward, we can advance, we can have more effective ways of understanding the proficiency. And so the way that we do it is they have a series of questions where they are answering an open-ended, they're providing an open-ended response to a question in real time. So an interviewer, and apologize for the mock-up scholar there, but so this is so they'll watch a video of an interviewer. They'll ask a question. They'll say something to the effect of, what do you hope you accomplish while you're here? And then the scholar hears a beep, and they're in real time. They're providing a response. And then next question. What cultural experiences do you have while you're here? And they don't know what questions are coming. And so for us, it's like, okay, you either understood the question or you didn't. You can either provide a fluent response, varying levels of fluency. You can provide a response, or you can't. So we look at it holistically across about 20 questions. And then our raters are watching them to provide a score, but they're also watching them for security reasons. We always have, most scholars are wonderfully honest, but there are occasionally things that happen that we kind of just have to laugh at. Like one time we had a scholar who was moving their mouth and then a voice was coming from back behind the computer, and it was clearly not synced up, or they hadn't memorized responses, and they were saying these memorized responses to the wrong questions, and so because they just didn't line up because they don't know what questions are coming. And so there's a lot of variety of what we see, but this is just a very practical way of like, did you understand what I said or not? Can you respond or not? And so the questions will cover everything from cultural experiences, medical emergencies, how would you respond in this situation, or do this. And then talking about their program or kind of generic questions about their institution. And so that's been our approach. And scholars seem to really appreciate that. They really appreciate the convenience of it. And then on the university side, their scores upload directly to Synopsys. If you're using the integration, or you have a dashboard that you can use, or they can upload their responses to Teradata, depending on, essentially we just would work with your workflows and your systems and just figure out what makes the most sense. But like I said, you can go in there at any point, you can watch the videos, and you can, watch for yourself their proficiency. I will say a shout out to Virginia Bloom, who used to be at Texas A&M. She would watch the videos for every scholar. And then when they would come for the in-person check-in, she would comment, she would call them out by name, talk about how she's excited to see them, and then she would comment on something from their video. And if you can imagine the nerves that could calm in a scholar who's in a new space, who doesn't know anybody, but has somebody who can provide that kind of welcome. How meaningful that could be for a scholar. So yeah, that's that we provide the score, and then we provide the interview video as well. And then as far as setting a minimum score, we would just work with you on setting your minimum score. Most institutions set 3 as their minimum score. Some have a 2.5. If they're going to be working with students, they, like for example, Northwestern, if they work with students, they put them at a 4. So if they're like a teaching assistant or something. So just depending on the role, they can, make different requirements there. But yeah, that's a quick general overview. And I do see there was one message to me directly. So it's a good call out, talking about interview prep for J scholars. We are going to be doing a webinar with some former visa officers in 2 weeks with visa tips for DSOs and AROs, talking about all the changes that have come through recently. And so how can you help your scholars or students in the help them prepare for their visa interview, and what changes are potentially coming. Let me grab the link for that webinar. I'll put the link for that webinar in the chat as soon as I can grab it. But yeah, and if there are any questions, we'd love to answer any questions. So I will. So the video questions are pre-recorded, and what that does is that allows them to conduct the interview, at 2 a.m. Eastern time. We just don't care when they do it. So the interview questions are pre-recorded. Sometimes there are individuals who have technical issues, or are coming from Iran, and we'll schedule a live Zoom call with them. And that's the same experience there. So we'll just do a live Zoom call, but that's not frequent. Usually it's the exact same experience for everybody, unless there's financial sanctions on a country. So we're still able to make that work. And then I will say that most scholars cover the cost themselves. Some institutions or some departments choose to purchase codes on behalf of the students or scholars. So there's the link that I just put in the, oopsies, I sent it directly to Karen. Let me put it to everybody. Okay, there's the link for the webinar on visa tips for DSOs and AROs. Okay, if there are no other questions, I think we could probably call it. So I'll pass it back to Karen.
Thank you, Moroni. Thank you, Sam. Okay, let's see. It is time for more sessions, so visit ioconference.info for information about more great session and special events. Today, attend Expo Hall at 3:10 Eastern, or join our Community Connect at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. If you need to keep this session conversation going, you can use the post-session room at bit.ly/IOC after session, and stay connected with everybody on IO Connection. Once again, thank you to all of our wonderful sponsors, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.